Some folks will tell you that power walks into a town wearing polished boots and a name everybody already knows. But I've lived long enough to see it come in quieter than that, carrying a worn valise and a face the dust has already claimed. And by the time the sun dips low, the same folks who didn't bother to look twice are standing a little straighter, speaking a little softer, wondering how they missed what was right in front of them all along. The train pulled out of Red Hollow just past noon, its whistle fading into the wide Texas sky, leaving behind a stretch of track that shimmered in the heat and a handful of passengers who had nowhere else to be. And among them stood Clara Whitmore, her gloved hands wrapped around the handle of a small, scuffed suitcase that looked too light to hold much of anything at all. The platform boards creaked under shifting boots, and the smell of coal smoke lingered in the air, mixing with dry dust and the faint sweetness of sun-warmed hay from somewhere beyond the station fence. But no one paid her much mind. Not the men leaning against the post outside the telegraph office. Not the woman sweeping the porch of the boarding house across the street. Not even the station master who had already turned his attention to a ledger book like her arrival was just another line he didn't need to remember. She wore a plain calico dress, faded at the seams and hemmed a little too short for fashion, her hair pinned back in a way that spoke more of practicality than pride. And if you'd passed her on any other day, in any other town, you might have thought she was just another mail-order bride who'd come west because there wasn't much left for her back east, the kind of woman folks measured in quiet glances and decided upon in less than a second. A wagon rolled up slow through the heat, wheels crunching over packed dirt, drawn by a pair of steady mules that didn't seem in any hurry to get anywhere at all, and the man holding the reins sat tall, but loose in the seat, hat pulled low against the glare, his shoulders carrying the kind of weight that didn't come from a single bad season, but from years of doing without saying much about it. And when he brought the wagon to a stop, he didn't call out her name or tip his hat like some men might have. He just looked at her, steady and quiet, as if giving her the space to decide whether she would step forward or stay where she was. Clara met his gaze without flinching, not bold, not challenging, just present in a way that didn't ask permission. And after a moment that stretched longer than it needed to, she lifted her suitcase and walked toward him, the dust rising soft around her boots with each step. And when she reached the wagon, he climbed down without a word, took the case from her hand like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and set it in the back beside a coil of rope and a dented water jug. "Elias Boone," he said finally, his voice low and rough, not unkind, just worn from use. And she nodded once. Clara Whitmore, her voice softer but steady, like someone who had learned not to spend more words than necessary. They stood there for a second, the town watching in the way towns do, not openly, but from corners and shadows and behind half-closed doors, measuring the distance between what they saw and what they assumed. And if anyone had asked in that moment what difference this woman would make to Red Hollow, they would have shrugged and said none at all, because she looked like the kind of story they had seen before, the kind that came and went without changing a thing. And yet the light that fell across the platform that afternoon had a way of catching on the small things, the set of her shoulders, the stillness in her hands, the way she stepped up into that wagon without waiting for help. And if you were paying close enough attention, you might have noticed that she wasn't arriving to be carried by the town, but to stand in it. And by the time the sun found its way down toward the horizon, Red Hollow would understand the difference. The wagon rolled out of Red Hollow slow and steady, the kind of pace that let a person notice things they might otherwise miss, like the way the wind carried fine red dust across the road in thin drifting lines, or how the buildings along Main Street leaned just slightly, as if they had settled into their place over years of sun and dry seasons and had no intention of moving again. And Clara sat beside Elias Boone with her hands folded in her lap, not gripping the seat, not bracing herself, just resting there like she had learned long ago that holding too tight did not change where you were headed. They passed the mercantile first, a wide front with a faded sign and barrels stacked along the porch, and a pair of men paused mid-conversation to watch them go by, their eyes lingering on Clara in a way that was not curious so much as measuring, like they were deciding what kind of story she would turn out to be before she had even spoken a word in their town. And further down the street, a woman standing in the doorway of the boarding house gave a small shake of her head, not unkind, but certain, like she had seen this same arrival play out too many times to expect anything different. Elias did not look their way, did not offer explanation or apology. He just kept the mules moving, the reins loose in his hands. But Clara noticed how his jaw set a little tighter when a voice carried from the shade of the mercantile porch, low enough to pretend it was not meant to be heard, but clear enough all the same. Something about another poor bride come looking for a roof and a name. And the words drifted after the wagon like dust that did not quite settle. Clara did not turn her head, did not answer, but her eyes moved once, just once, taking in the storefronts, the narrow alley between the bank and the barber, the way the bank itself stood a little taller than the rest with its brick front and clean windows, and there was a stillness in her expression that did not match the assumption being made about her. A quiet kind of attention that felt less like someone arriving and more like someone taking account. The road bent as they left the center of town, giving way to open land where fences stretched in long, uneven lines and the grass thinned out to patches of stubborn green between wide stretches of hard earth, and the air changed there, losing the close smell of wood smoke and settling into something broader, sun and distance and the faint hint of water somewhere too far off to see. Elias shifted the reins and finally spoke, not turning toward her, just letting the words fall into the space between them. It is not much out there, and there was no apology in it, just a statement of fact, the kind a man made when he had nothing to dress it up with. And Clara nodded once. That will do, she said, simple and certain, like she had not come expecting more than what was real. He glanced at her then, quick and almost against his own habit, and there was a flicker of something like surprise, not at her answer, but at the way she gave it without hesitation, without the careful politeness most people used when they were unsure of their place, and he looked back to the road, but the glance had been enough to mark the difference. A weathered fence came into view ahead, one rail sagging lower than the others, and beyond it sat the ranch, a small house set back from the road with a porch that caught the late afternoon light, a barn off to the side, and land that had seen better seasons but had not yet given up, and Clara leaned forward just slightly, not enough to be noticed by anyone not watching close, but enough to take it in, the spacing of the buildings, the condition of the fence, the way the gate hung on its hinge. And there was that same quiet counting in her eyes, like she was placing each detail where it belonged. The wagon rolled to a stop near the porch, and Elias climbed down first, tying off the reins before reaching back for her case. But Clara had already stepped down on her own, her boots finding the ground steady, and for a moment they stood side by side in the stillness of the place, the sound of the mules shifting and the faint creak of wood the only movement around them. And if the town behind them had already decided who Clara Whitmore was, the land in front of her had not yet made up its mind, and she stood there not like someone asking to be let in, but like someone ready to begin. The porch boards gave a low, familiar creak under Elias Boone's boots as he stepped up first, the sound carrying across the yard like something that had been repeated often enough to settle into the wood itself. And Clara followed a moment later, her steps lighter but no less certain, her gaze moving over the small details that most folks would pass by without a second thought. The worn edge of the doorframe where hands had pushed it open year after year, the nail set just slightly crooked near the window, the faint line in the dust where something had been dragged and not quite put back the way it belonged. Elias pushed the door open and stepped inside without ceremony, and the air that met them was cooler, holding the quiet of a place that had been lived in but not shared, the kind of quiet that did not come from peace so much as habit. And Clara paused just inside the threshold, not out of hesitation, but as if marking the moment, the way a person might before stepping into a place that was about to become theirs whether they had planned for it or not. The room was simple, a table set near the window with two chairs that did not quite match, a cast-iron stove in the corner, shelves lined with tins and jars placed with a kind of order that felt more like necessity than care, and everything carried a thin layer of dust that had settled in corners and along edges where no one had bothered to chase it away for some time. Elias set her suitcase down near the wall and moved to the stove, opening it to check the ash with a motion so practiced it did not seem like a choice, just the next step in a day that had already been decided. And he spoke without looking at her. Your room is through that door. The words plain and without softness, but not unkind, just the way a man spoke when he did not have the habit of explaining himself. Clara nodded, though he could not see it, and instead of moving right away, she walked to the table, her fingers brushing lightly across its surface, not to test for dust, but to feel the grain of the wood beneath it, the small ridges worn smooth in places where hands had rested, and there was a quiet recognition in that touch, like she understood something about the life that had unfolded here without needing it told to her. She crossed to the narrow doorway and stepped into the small room beyond, where a simple bed stood against the wall with a quilt folded at the foot, faded but carefully stitched, and a single window let in a narrow slice of afternoon light that fell across the floor in a line sharp enough to show every mote of dust drifting through it. And Clara set her hand on the bed frame. Steady, not claiming, just acknowledging. "This will do," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach Elias in the other room. He did not answer right away, and when he did, it was only a short nod of sound, like agreement without discussion, and he stepped outside again, leaving the door open behind him, the light shifting as he moved past it. Clara stood alone for a moment, listening to the quiet, the kind that pressed gently rather than heavily, and then she turned back into the main room, her eyes moving over the shelves more carefully now, the arrangement of jars, the spacing between them, the small stack of papers near the corner of the table, folded but not put away, and she picked one up, not out of curiosity, but with the ease of someone used to reading what others left unattended. The paper crackled softly in her hand, the ink slightly faded but clear enough, numbers, dates, a name she had heard once already in town, and her eyes moved across the lines with a steadiness that did not match the picture of a woman who had arrived with nothing, and she set it back exactly where it had been, not a fraction of an inch out of place. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to stir the dry grass, and Elias stood near the fence, his back to the house, looking out over land that had more silence than promise in it. And when he turned back toward the door, he found Clara standing in the frame, not waiting, not unsure, just there, and for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, not a change he could name. Just the faint sense that the house behind him was no longer holding the same kind of quiet it had that morning. The light shifted as the afternoon began to lean toward evening, stretching long across the yard and slipping in through the open doorway in a way that made the dust inside the house glow soft instead of dull. And Clara moved through that light without hurry, not rearranging everything at once the way some might, but touching one thing at a time. A chair turned just slightly so it faced the table instead of the wall. A tin cup set closer to the edge where a hand would reach for it without thinking. Small changes that did not announce themselves, but altered the feel of the room all the same. Elias watched from the porch at first, his shoulder resting against the doorframe, hat pushed back just enough to let the air move across his forehead, and he did not step in, not yet, as if the space needed a moment to settle around her before he took his place in it again, and from where he stood, he could hear the quiet rhythm of her movements, the soft scrape of wood, the faint clink of metal, nothing loud. Nothing forced, just the sound of someone making use of what was already there. When he finally stepped inside, it was with the same careful weight he used when crossing a creek on loose stones, testing without making a show of it. And he noticed first what had not changed, the same table, the same stove, the same narrow shelf along the wall. But then the difference settled in, not in the objects themselves, but in how they seemed to belong together now, like the room had found its center without anyone naming it. Clara stood near the stove, her sleeves pushed back just enough to free her hands, a small fire catching in the iron belly with a low steady glow, and the smell of coffee began to rise, strong and plain, the kind that did not promise comfort but delivered it anyway. And she did not ask if he wanted any. She simply set 2 cups on the table as if the answer had already been decided. Elias paused near the door, one hand still resting against the frame, and for a moment he did not move forward, not because he did not want to, but because the sight of 2 cups where there had always been one held him there longer than expected, and when he crossed the room at last, he did it quietly, taking the chair she had angled toward the table without comment. They sat without speaking, the kind of silence that had lived in the house long before Clara arrived. But something in it had shifted, less heavy, less final, and when she poured the coffee, her hand was steady, not careful in the way of someone afraid to spill, but sure in the way of someone used to doing a thing right the first time. Outside, the wind moved across the open land, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves from somewhere down the road, distant but growing closer, and Elias's gaze lifted just slightly, not turning his head, just listening, the way a man does when he knows a sound might carry more than it first appears. Clara noticed the change without asking, her eyes moving toward the window for only a second before returning to the cup in front of her, and she took a slow sip, as if the moment did not require interruption. The sound came clearer then, a wagon or two, not hurried, but deliberate, and Elias set his cup down without finishing it, the motion small but firm, and he stood, crossing to the door in 3 quiet steps, his shoulders settling into a different kind of stillness, one that came when a man knew he was about to be called to account for something he had not yet agreed to give. Clara did not rise right away. She simply watched him for a breath, then stood as well, not trailing behind him, not staying back, but moving to stand just within the doorway, close enough to see, far enough not to crowd. And as the shapes of 2 wagons came into view at the edge of the yard, their wheels cutting slow lines through the dust, the air between the house and the road seemed to tighten, not with fear, but with the quiet understanding that whatever had been waiting beyond the horizon had arrived sooner than expected, and Clara Whitmore, who had been measured and dismissed before the day had even settled, stood there with the same calm she had carried off the train, as if she had been expecting this all along. The wagons did not stop at the fence the way a neighbor might, nor did they roll in careless like men with nothing to settle. They came steady and straight up the drive, wheels cutting deep enough into the dry ground to leave marks that would hold long after they were gone, and Elias Boone stood with one hand resting against the doorframe, not stepping forward to greet them, not stepping back to avoid them, just holding his place like a man who had learned that moving too soon could cost more than standing still. The first wagon came to a halt 10 yards from the porch, the team stamping once as the reins tightened, and the man seated up front took his time before climbing down, brushing dust from his coat in a way that spoke more of habit than need, his boots clean enough to tell he had not been working land that day. And behind him, the second wagon settled with a soft creak of wood and leather, carrying 2 more men who stayed seated but watched everything with quiet attention. "Afternoon, Boone," the first man said, his voice smooth in a way that did not quite match the place, like it belonged more to an office than open ground, and Elias gave a short nod, not offering the same greeting back, just acknowledging the presence without inviting it closer. Clara remained where she was in the doorway, not hidden behind him, not stepping ahead, her hands resting loosely at her sides, and her eyes moved once across the scene, taking in the number of men, the way they held themselves, the space they left between one another, the kind of things that told a story without needing to be spoken aloud. "We came about the matter of the note," the man continued, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket but not opening it yet, as if the weight of it was enough on its own, and the word note hung in the air between them, simple, familiar, and heavier than it should have been for something written on paper. Elias's jaw shifted slightly, just enough to show he had heard it, and he stepped forward 1 pace, closing the distance between himself and the edge of the porch. "That matter was not due till the end of the month," he said, his voice low but steady, and the man gave a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "Schedules change," he replied, "same as the weather out here," and one of the men on the second wagon shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the wood, a sound that carried more intent than the words that had been spoken so far. Clara's gaze moved to the paper in the man's hand, not with curiosity, but with recognition, and though she had not seen that exact document before, the shape of it, the way it was held, the way it was introduced into the conversation, all of it fit into a pattern she seemed to understand without needing it explained, and she took 1 step forward then, not enough to interrupt, just enough that the light from outside fell fully across her face instead of leaving her half in shadow. The man's eyes flicked toward her, brief, assessing, and he gave a slight tilt of his head, not quite respectful, not quite dismissive, and Clara met the look without lowering her gaze, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not challenge but did not yield either. "You brought the bank with you," she said, her voice even, the kind that did not need to rise to be heard, and there was a small pause that followed, not long, but enough to shift the weight of the moment, because it was not what she said so much as how she said it, like she had named something that was meant to stay unspoken. The man glanced down at the paper in his hand for a fraction of a second before looking back up, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed just enough to notice. "We brought what was necessary," he said, and Elias turned his head slightly toward Clara, not fully, just enough to catch her in his peripheral, as if reassessing something he had not expected to consider so soon. The wind moved across the yard again, lifting a thin line of dust between the porch and the wagons, and Clara stood steady in it, not shielding her face, not stepping back, and there was something in the way she held herself, in the way she had placed a single sentence into the middle of a conversation that had not invited her, that suggested she was not standing there to witness what would happen, but to take part in it. And, for the first time since the wagons had arrived, the men out in the yard were not only looking at Elias Boone, they were looking at her. The air held still for a moment after her words, the kind of stillness that does not come from calm, but from something shifting just beneath the surface. And the man with the paper let out a slow breath through his nose, as if adjusting to a change he had not planned for, his fingers tightening slightly on the fold before he opened it at last, smoothing it with deliberate care, like the act itself carried weight enough to settle the conversation back into his control. Elias did not speak, not yet, but his stance changed by a fraction, his shoulders angling just enough that he was no longer fully between Clara and the men, not stepping aside, but not closing her out either, and that small adjustment did not go unnoticed by anyone standing in the yard. The paper caught the late afternoon light, the ink dark against it, and the man began to read, not loudly, not for show, but clear enough that every word carried, referencing dates, sums, terms that sounded plain on their own but gathered meaning as they fell into place. And Clara listened without interruption, her gaze steady on the page rather than the man, as if she were reading along without needing to see the lines herself. When he finished, he lowered the paper just slightly, leaving it half raised between them, and gave a look that suggested the matter had now been made official by the act of speaking it aloud, and Elias's voice came low in response. "The terms were set," he said, his tone even, not arguing the words so much as the timing, and the man gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the point without conceding anything at all. "Terms can be revisited," he replied, "particularly when circumstances change," and one of the men behind him shifted again, the faint jingle of tacks sounding from the second wagon, subtle but enough to remind anyone listening that this was not a casual visit. Clara stepped forward then, not onto the dirt, not down from the porch, but just enough that she stood beside Elias instead of behind him, and she held her hands together loosely, not clasped tight, not folded away, just resting. And when she spoke, her voice did not cut through the moment. It settled into it, quiet and certain. "The original note references a 30-day term from the first of the month," she said, and there was no question in it, only statement. And the man's eyes flicked toward her again, this time sharper, more focused, as if the outline he had drawn in his mind was beginning to blur at the edges. "That is correct," he said after a beat, and Clara gave the smallest nod, her gaze shifting briefly to the horizon, as if marking the sun's position without needing to measure it exactly. "Then you are early," she said, and the words did not accuse, did not challenge. They simply placed a fact where it could not be moved, and the quiet that followed stretched longer than the one before, because now the balance of the conversation had shifted in a way that could not be easily set back. Elias turned his head fully toward her this time, just for a second, and in that glance there was no confusion, only a recognition that something had been added to the moment that he had not brought himself. And when he looked back to the men in the yard, his posture held a different kind of steadiness, one that did not come from standing alone. The man with the paper lowered it the rest of the way, folding it once more with careful precision, as if deciding how much of his next move should be spoken and how much should be held back. And when he spoke again, his tone had lost a measure of its earlier ease. "The bank has its interests," he said, and Clara inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a point in a conversation she had already anticipated. "And so do we," she answered, not louder, not firmer, just placed, and the men on the wagons did not move, but their attention had settled in a way that suggested they were no longer watching a simple exchange between a debtor and a creditor, but something else, something that had begun the moment Clara Whitmore chose to step into the space beside Elias Boone and speak, as though she had every right to be heard. The wind eased just enough to let the silence settle properly between them, and for a moment, no one spoke, Not because there was nothing left to say, but because each person standing there understood that the next words would carry more weight than the last. And the man with the paper shifted his stance, one boot pressing deeper into the dust, as if grounding himself before continuing. He studied Clara now with a different kind of attention, no longer dismissing her as part of the scenery around Elias Boone, but measuring her the way one measures a change in the weather that might not yet be visible on the horizon, but can be felt in the air all the same. "You speak like someone who has seen more of these matters than most," he said, his tone no longer smooth, but edged with something closer to caution, and Clara did not answer right away. She simply let the statement sit where it had been placed, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and when she did speak, it was not to explain herself, but to move the conversation forward. "The bank would have filed notice before adjusting the term," she said, and her eyes flicked once to the folded paper in his hand, not asking to see it, just acknowledging its place in the exchange. "There is no seal on that, is there?" she added, and though her voice remained even, the question landed differently than anything that had come before it, because it did not challenge the man directly, it challenged the ground he stood on. The man hesitated, just for a breath, but it was enough for Elias to see it, enough for the men on the wagon to notice the shift in their own footing, and the paper in his hand did not move, did not open again, and that stillness spoke louder than any answer he might have given. "Procedures vary," he said after a moment, but the words lacked the certainty they had carried earlier, and Clara inclined her head slightly, as if accepting that answer for what it was, not a truth, but a step away from one. "Of course they do," she said quietly, and the way she said it made it sound less like agreement and more like a recognition of something already understood, and the air between them tightened again, not with tension this time, but with clarity. Elias let out a slow breath, one he had not realized he had been holding, and his weight shifted forward, not aggressively, not pushing, but standing more fully in the space beside Clara rather than just occupying it. And his voice came steady when he spoke. "You have said what you came to say," he told the man, and there was no anger in it, just a line drawn clean and straight. The man's gaze moved between them, taking in the distance that had closed, the way Clara did not step back, the way Elias did not step in front of her, and something in his expression changed again, not quite retreat, but no longer pressing forward with the same confidence he had arrived with. "This is not finished," he said, folding the paper once more and tucking it back into his coat, and Clara's eyes followed the motion, not to track the paper itself, but to mark the decision behind it, and she gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a conversation that would continue elsewhere, under different terms. "It rarely is," she replied, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, not sharper, not louder, but grounded, like a person who understood not only the moment in front of them, but the ones that would follow. The men returned to their wagons without further words, the wheels turning slowly as they pulled back toward the road, and the dust rose behind them in thin lines that caught the last of the sunlight, and Elias stood where he was until the sound of the wheels faded into the distance, and only then did he turn toward Clara, his gaze steady, searching not for answers, but for understanding, and she met it without hesitation, her expression unchanged, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred at all, and yet the space between them held something new, something that had not been there when the day began, a quiet recognition that whatever Clara Whitmore had carried with her into Red Hollow, it was not something that could be easily set aside or overlooked. The last of the dust settled slowly back onto the road, as if the land itself was deciding whether to remember what had just taken place or let it pass like any other afternoon, and for a long moment neither Clara nor Elias moved, the quiet returning in layers, first the absence of wheels, then the absence of voices, until only the low sound of the wind brushing across dry grass remained. Elias let his gaze linger toward the horizon where the wagons had disappeared, his jaw set not in anger, but in the kind of thinking that did not rush toward conclusions, and when he finally turned back, he did not look at the house. He looked at Clara, steady and direct, as if the answer to something he had not yet put into words might be standing right in front of him. "You knew what they were doing before they said it," he said, his voice low, not accusing, not demanding, just placing a truth between them the way she had done minutes earlier, and Clara held his gaze for a moment before answering, her expression unchanged, the way a person looks when they are not deciding what to say, but how much to say. "I have seen papers like that before," she replied, her tone even, and she turned slightly, stepping back into the house without breaking the line of the conversation, as if the place itself now belonged to both of them equally in moments like this. Elias followed after a brief pause, closing the door partway behind him, not fully shut, leaving a thin line of light along the edge that cut across the floor, and he moved to the table, resting his hands against the worn wood as if grounding himself in something solid. Clara crossed to the shelf where the folded papers lay, the same ones she had noticed earlier, and she picked them up again, this time not just observing, but opening them fully, the pages making a soft crackling sound as they unfolded, and she spread them across the table with a care that suggested familiarity rather than hesitation. Elias watched her hands more than the papers themselves, the way she aligned the edges, the way her fingers traced the lines, not to read them slowly, but to confirm what she already understood, and there was no show in it, no attempt to impress, just quiet competence settling into the space between them. "This one," she said after a moment, tapping lightly near a line of numbers, "is not structured to be paid off cleanly," and Elias frowned slightly, leaning in just enough to see where she pointed, not crowding her. "Just following." "What do you mean?" he asked, and Clara shifted one of the pages, placing another beside it so the two could be seen together. "The dates do not align with the interest calculation," she said, her voice calm. "And if it continues this way, the amount never truly settles. It only rolls forward," and the words did not come fast. They came steady, like someone laying out a path one step at a time, so there was no confusion about where it led. Elias straightened slowly, the meaning settling in not all at once, but piece by piece, like something he had suspected without knowing how to name, and he let out a breath that was almost a quiet laugh, but without humor. "They never meant for it to be finished," he said, and Clara did not answer right away. She simply looked at the papers again, then back at him, her gaze steady, not surprised, not shaken, just certain. "No," she said softly, "they did not." The room held that understanding for a moment, the weight of it not crushing, but clarifying, like a window had been opened where there had been none before, and Elias reached for the back of the chair, pulling it out just slightly before sitting, his posture less guarded than it had been earlier, not relaxed, but no longer braced for something he could not see. Clara gathered the papers again, not stacking them away, but keeping them in front of her, and she looked toward the door where the last line of sunlight was beginning to fade. "They will come again," she said, not as a warning, but as a fact, and Elias nodded once, his gaze following hers toward the dimming light. "I know," he replied, and there was no fear in it, only acknowledgement. Clara's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, near the two cups that still held the last of their coffee, now gone lukewarm, and she spoke again, her voice quieter, but no less steady. "Next time we meet them in town," and the sentence did not sound like a suggestion, it sounded like the first step of something already decided, and Elias looked at her then, really looked this time. Not at the dust on her dress or the small suitcase she had arrived with, but at the way she sat in his house, like she had always known how to stand her ground, and he gave a slow nod, not because he had been convinced, but because he understood that whatever had arrived in Red Hollow that afternoon had changed more than just a conversation on his porch. They left just as the last light slipped behind the low ridge west of the ranch, the sky turning the kind of deep amber that only lasted a few minutes before giving way to blue and then to black, and Elias drove the wagon this time, without the slow wandering pace of earlier, not rushing, but with purpose set into the way he held the reins, while Clara sat beside him, the folded papers resting in her lap, her hands still but not idle, her fingers occasionally brushing the edges as if confirming they were still there. The road into Red Hollow felt different in the fading light, less open, more defined, every turn and dip in the ground holding a kind of quiet memory of the day that had already passed, and as they approached the town, the first lamps were being lit, small points of yellow glow behind windows and along the boardwalk, each one marking a place where people gathered, watched, and decided what mattered. Neither of them spoke much on the way, not because there was nothing to say, but because the shape of what needed to happen next did not require many words, and when the wagon rolled onto Main Street, The sound of the wheels carried farther in the evening stillness than it had in the afternoon, drawing attention in a way that could not be avoided. A few heads turned from the mercantile porch, conversations lowering without fully stopping, and the same eyes that had measured Clara earlier that day found her again, this time with a longer look, not yet understanding what had changed, only sensing that something had. Elias brought the wagon to a stop in front of the bank, the brick face catching the lamplight in a way that made it stand apart from the wooden buildings around it. And he stepped down first, not offering a hand, not out of disregard, but because he had already learned she did not need it, and Clara followed on her own, the hem of her dress brushing lightly against the step as she moved. The door to the bank stood closed, but light showed through the glass, steady and bright, and Clara paused for just a second before stepping forward, not hesitating, just marking the moment the way she had at the threshold of the house. And Elias came up beside her, not leading, not following, simply present. Inside, the air was warmer, carrying the faint smell of ink and paper and the kind of order that came from things being kept in their proper place. And behind the counter stood the same man from earlier, his coat now off, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest he had been working, though his hands looked too clean for it. And when he looked up and saw them, there was a brief flicker of something across his face, surprise, perhaps, or calculation, before it settled back into a practiced neutrality. "I was not expecting you this evening," he said, his voice controlled, but no longer carrying the ease it had before, and Clara stepped forward before Elias could answer, placing the folded papers gently on the counter, not sliding them across, just setting them down as if they already belonged there. "Then it is fortunate we came," she replied, her tone even, and the words did not challenge, they aligned, like she was continuing a conversation he had hoped to delay. The man's gaze dropped to the papers, then back to her, and the room seemed to narrow slightly, not in space, but in focus, as if everything beyond the three of them had faded into the background, and Clara rested her hands lightly on the counter's edge, her posture relaxed but anchored, the kind that did not ask for permission to speak. "We would like to review the terms in full," she said, and there was no uncertainty in it, no suggestion that this was a request that might be denied, and Elias stood just behind her shoulder, not silent because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that the moment had shifted into a place where her voice carried further than his would, and for the first time since he had walked into that bank, he was not the man being called in to answer. He was the one standing beside someone who had come to ask the questions. The man behind the counter did not reach for the papers right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, carried more weight than if he had refused outright, because it showed a pause where there had been none earlier that day, and Clara did not fill that pause with more words. She simply let it settle, her hands still resting on the worn edge of the counter, as if time itself was something she could afford to wait on. At last, he moved, drawing the papers closer with a measured motion, unfolding them again beneath the lamplight, and his eyes moved across the lines more carefully now, not scanning, but reading, and Elias watched from just behind Clara, his gaze shifting between the man's face and the documents, seeing for the first time how much of this exchange had always taken place in spaces he had not been invited to understand. "These are standard terms," the man said after a moment, but the certainty in his voice had softened, no longer the kind that closed a conversation, more the kind that tested whether it might still be held open, and Clara inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Standard does not mean fair," she replied, her tone even, and she reached forward, not to take the papers back, but to turn one page just enough to reveal a line near the bottom, her finger resting lightly beside it without tapping or pressing. "Here," she said, and the man's eyes followed the motion, drawn not by force, but by precision. "The interest adjustment compounds every 14 days, but the payment schedule reflects a 30-day cycle," and there was no emphasis in her voice, no attempt to make the point larger than it was. She simply placed it where it could not be ignored. The man's brow tightened slightly as he read the line again, his lips pressing together in a way that suggested calculation rather than resistance, and he did not answer immediately, which in itself was an answer of a different kind. "That is within acceptable variance," he said finally, but the words sounded less certain than before, and Clara did not challenge them directly. She only shifted her gaze to meet his, steady and clear. It ensures the balance never settles, she said, and the quiet that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was final in a way that left little room for deflection. Elias felt something in his chest ease at that. Not relief, not yet, but the sense of standing on ground that had been named at last, and he straightened slightly, his presence no longer just a witness, but part of the line Clara had drawn. The man folded his hands over the papers, looking at them as if they might offer him a different answer if given enough time. But the lines did not change, and neither did the truth they held. And when he looked up again, the balance in the room had shifted fully, not because Clara had raised her voice or pressed harder, but because she had placed each piece exactly where it belonged. "What is it you are asking?" he said, and there was no longer any pretense of dismissal in the question, only a careful recognition that the conversation had moved beyond where he had intended to keep it. Clara let the silence stretch just long enough to mark the weight of what would come next, her hands still, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, it was not with urgency, but with clarity. "We are asking for the terms to reflect a true settlement," she said, and her gaze did not waver, "a schedule that closes the balance instead of carrying it forward," and the words settled into the room like something that had been waiting to be said long before either of them walked through the door. Outside, the faint sound of voices drifted from the street, muted by distance and wood, but inside the bank, the space had narrowed to a single point of decision, and Elias stood there beside her, understanding now that the woman who had arrived that afternoon with dust on her hem and a quiet voice was not someone stepping into his life to be sheltered, but someone who had already begun to change the shape of it. The question did not linger in the air the way the others had. It settled instead, firm and unavoidable, and the man behind the counter drew a slow breath as if measuring not only his answer, but the consequences that would follow it, his fingers pressing lightly against the paper before he lifted his gaze to meet Clara's again, no longer searching for a way around her words, but through them. "You are asking for a revision," he said, and there was no challenge in it now, only a careful naming of the shift that had taken place, and Clara gave the smallest nod, not in concession, but in confirmation, as if the shape of the conversation had finally aligned with the truth of it. "A revision that reflects what was agreed in good faith," she replied, and her voice held steady, not rising, not softening, simply holding its place, and the room seemed to take that in, the lamplight steady on the counter, the quiet stretching just enough to carry the weight of what had been said. The man's gaze dropped again to the papers, but this time it did not linger long, and when he looked back up, something in his posture had shifted, not weakened, but adjusted, like a man stepping onto different ground and finding his footing anew. "The bank does not often amend its terms," he said, but the words were no longer a barrier. They were an admission of the structure he worked within, and Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it without stepping back from her position. "Then perhaps it is time it did," she said, and there was no edge in it, only a quiet certainty that did not require force to be felt. Elias stood just behind her shoulder, his presence steady, and though he had not spoken, there was a change in the way he held himself, less guarded, more anchored, as if the line she had drawn had become something he could stand within rather than against. The man exhaled slowly, his hand moving to straighten the papers in front of him, aligning them with a precision that suggested more thought than habit, and he glanced once toward the door, where the faint murmur of the town carried through the glass, a reminder that whatever was decided here would not remain contained within these walls. "There are considerations beyond the document itself," he said, and Clara's gaze followed his briefly to the door before returning, her expression unchanged, understanding without yielding. "There always are," she answered, and the simplicity of it left little room for argument, because it did not deny the truth of his words, it placed them within a larger one. The man studied her for a moment longer, and then something in his expression settled, not into agreement, not entirely, but into a recognition that the conversation could not return to where it had begun, and he reached for a clean sheet of paper from beneath the counter, the motion deliberate, unhurried, as if marking a line between what had been and what would follow. "I can draft an adjustment for review," he said, and though the words were measured, they carried a shift that could not be undone, and Clara gave a small nod, her hands still resting lightly on the counter, not claiming the moment, but acknowledging it as it came. "That will be sufficient," she replied, and the room seemed to ease, not with relief, but with clarity, as if something that had been held tight had finally been set in its proper place. Elias let out a quiet breath, one he had not noticed holding, and his gaze moved to Clara again, not questioning, not surprised, but seeing her in a way he had not earlier that day, not as someone who had arrived needing a place to stay, but as someone who had stepped into a room that had never been made for her and reshaped it without raising her voice. Outside, the town continued as it always had, lamps burning, voices carrying, but inside that bank, something had shifted, something that would carry beyond the walls and into the streets. And as the man began to write, the scratch of pen against paper sounding steady and deliberate, Clara Whitmore stood where she was, calm and composed, as if she had always known this was how the evening would end. The pen moved steadily across the paper, each stroke deliberate, the sound of it filling the quiet in a way that felt almost ceremonial. And Clara did not watch the words as they formed. She watched the man writing them, the slight tightening in his jaw, the careful pauses between lines, the way his hand slowed at certain phrases as if weighing not only the ink, but the implications behind it. Elias stood beside her, not leaning, not shifting, just present. And for the first time since stepping into the bank, his attention was not divided between the room and the outcome. It rested fully in the moment itself, in the understanding that what was happening here would carry beyond numbers and terms into something that touched the way this town measured a man, and now, a woman. When the man finished, he lifted the paper, slightly, letting the ink catch the lamplight just enough to show it had settled. Then he placed it flat again, turning it toward Clara with a motion that held no reluctance, only the weight of acknowledgement. "Please review," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a shift that did not need to be named. Clara stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the page as she drew it nearer, and her eyes moved across the lines with the same quiet precision she had shown before, not searching for errors, but confirming alignment. And there was no tension in her posture, no urgency, only the steady presence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. A few seconds passed, no more than that, and she gave a small nod, not dramatic, not emphasized, just enough to mark the moment. "This reflects the agreed terms," she said, and she set the paper back down without holding on to it, as if the need to prove anything had already passed. The man inclined his head in return, a gesture that stopped just short of respect, but had left dismissal far behind, and he reached for a pen again, offering it across the counter, not pushing it forward, just placing it where it could be taken. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second, the habit of caution still present, but then he stepped forward, taking the pen in his hand, and when he signed, he did so without looking up, the motion steady, not rushed, not uncertain, just final. Clara watched, not the signature itself, but the way his hand did not falter, and when he finished, she took the pen next, not because it was required, but because she chose to, and her name followed his on the line beneath, written in a script that was even and practiced, the kind that spoke of years spent with ink and paper rather than chance. The man took the document back, folding it carefully, not as he had before, but with a different kind of attention, as if what it held now carried a weight he could not ignore, and he placed it aside with a small nod that marked the end of the exchange. Outside, the town had not gone quiet, but the sounds had softened, voices lower, footsteps slower, the night settling in, and when Clara stepped back from the counter, there was no sense of triumph in her movement, no outward sign that anything extraordinary had taken place, only the same composed stillness she had carried since stepping off the train. Elias moved with her toward the door, opening it this time without hesitation, and as they stepped out into the evening air, the coolness of it brushing against their faces, a few people along the street turned to look, not openly, but with that same quiet attention towns held for moments they did not yet understand. The lamps cast long shadows across the boards, and for a moment they stood there side by side, the bank behind them, the town in front, and Elias glanced at Clara, not with question, not with doubt, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition. "You did not need me in there," he said, his voice low, not bitter, not distant, just honest, and Clara looked out toward the street before answering, her gaze steady, No, she said softly, and then after a brief pause, she added, but I chose to stand beside you anyway. And the words settled between them with a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening air, something unspoken finding its place without needing to be named. And Elias gave a small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than words, as they turned together toward the wagon, the night stretching out ahead, no longer empty, but holding something that had begun to take shape. The wagon rolled out of Red Hollow slower than it had arrived, not from hesitation, but from the way the night seemed to stretch the road, turning every turn and rise into something quieter, more deliberate, and Elias did not urge the mules on. He let them take their pace, the steady rhythm of hooves against packed dirt settling into the kind of silence that no longer pressed, but rested. Clara sat beside him, her hands folded loosely in her lap, the faint glow of the lantern casting soft light across her sleeves, and for a while neither of them spoke, not because the moment called for words, but because it did not need them, the weight of what had happened already finding its place between them. The town behind them dimmed into scattered points of light, then into darkness altogether, and the open land took over again. Wide and still, the sky above clear enough to show the first stars settling in, one by one, like something being revealed slowly rather than all at once. Elias shifted the reins slightly, guiding the wagon along the familiar bend in the road, and after a time he spoke, not looking at her, just letting the words fall into the quiet. They will talk about this, he said, his voice low, and Clara gave a small nod, her gaze still ahead. They always do, she replied, and there was no concern in it, only a simple recognition of how towns worked, how stories moved from one porch to another until they settled into something that sounded like truth. Elias let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh if it had carried more sound. You changed more than the terms in there, he said, and this time she turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him. I did not change anything, she answered, her tone calm. I only made it visible, and the words hung between them in a way that did not invite argument, only understanding. The ranch came into view ahead, the outline of the house faint against the dark, the porch catching just enough moonlight to mark its shape. And when the wagon came to a stop, Elias climbed down first, tying off the reins with the same steady motions he always used. But something in him had shifted, not in what he did, but in how he carried it, as if the ground beneath him had settled into something firmer than it had been that morning. Clara stepped down beside him, her boots finding the earth without hesitation, and they walked to the door together, not in step, but not apart either, the distance between them easy, unforced. Inside, the house held the quiet they had left earlier, but it felt different now, less like something waiting, more like something beginning, and Clara moved to the table, setting the lantern down before reaching for the coffee pot. The simple act of pouring 2 cups again falling into place as if it had always belonged there. Elias watched her for a moment, the way she moved through the space without asking where anything was, without second-guessing her place in it. And he crossed the room, taking his seat without being told, his hands resting on the table in front of him. They drank in silence at first, the warmth of the coffee cutting through the cool of the night. And after a moment Elias spoke again, his voice quieter now, but clearer. How long have you known how to do that? He asked, not specifying what, because he did not need to, and Clara's hands stilled briefly around her cup before she set it down, her fingers resting lightly against the worn wood. Long enough, she said, and there was no pride in it, no defense, just a truth offered without decoration, and Elias nodded once, accepting it without pressing further, because whatever answer lay behind those words, he understood it was not something given all at once. The lamp flickered softly, casting shifting light across the table, the 2 cups, the space between them, and for a while they sat like that, not strangers, not yet something more defined, but no longer alone in the way they had been before the day began. And as the night settled fully around the house, the silence that filled it was no longer empty. It held something steady, something shared, like a place that had finally found 2 people willing to stand in it together.